In the quiet town of Auburndale, Florida, neighbors knew the Griffith family as private people. Catherine Griffith was a 39-year-old mother, hardworking, and protective of her teenage son, Colin. From the outside, their home looked like any other suburban residence: trimmed grass, a small porch, and a peaceful street. But behind those walls, tension had been brewing for years. Catherine had raised Colin mostly on her own. She was determined to provide him with structure, stability, and a sense of direction, something every parent hopes for. But as Colin got older, that bond began to change. Friends and relatives would later describe their relationship as complicated. Catherine was strict, and Colin, now 17, had started pushing back in ways that alarmed those around them. What no one realized was just how volatile things had become inside the Griffith home. Catherine's friends remembered her as strong-willed and outspoken. She worked long hours, but made time for Colin's schooling and activities. Yet, she also confided in a few close friends that things had become hard to manage. Colin had begun isolating himself, shutting his bedroom door, skipping classes, and sometimes refusing to speak for days. Neighbors reported hearing shouting at night. At first, they dismissed it as normal teenage rebellion, but it was more than that. Police had visited their home before for domestic disputes, and Catherine had even tried to get help for Colin through the Baker Act, a Florida law that allows temporary mental health evaluation when someone is considered a danger to themselves or others. Catherine believed her son was struggling deeply, and she was desperate to help him, but each attempt only seemed to drive them further apart. Before we go deeper into this heartbreaking case, if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. At Truthful Crime, we bring you real stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary and tragic circumstances. Every case we tell reminds us how fragile human relationships can be, and how quickly love can turn into fear. Now, let's return to the story. By late summer of 2024, Catherine's relationship with Colin had reached a breaking point. Just a year earlier, he had been involved in another shocking event that few families could ever recover from. While visiting his father in Oklahoma, Colin had shot and killed him during what he claimed was self-defense. That case had been investigated, but the charges were dropped, leaving lingering questions and emotional scars that followed both mother and son back to Florida. Catherine tried to start over. She moved into a new home in Auburndale, away from the painful memories of the past. She wanted Colin to finish high school, to get counseling, to have a chance at a normal life again. But the shadow of what had happened in Oklahoma never really left them. Locals later said Catherine seemed tired, as though she was constantly on edge. One friend remembered her saying, "I'm doing everything I can for him, but I'm scared. I don't know what else to do." On the night of the tragedy, September 11th, 2024, everything came to a boiling point. According to reports, neighbors heard loud arguing coming from the Griffith home. One neighbor stepped outside after hearing what sounded like a woman crying for help. Moments later, she saw a shocking sight: Colin dragging his mother toward the house as she struggled and begged to be released. No one could have imagined what would happen next. A short time later, a 911 call came in. The voice on the other end was Colin's. He told the dispatcher that he and his mother had gotten into a fight and that she had somehow fallen on a knife. Emergency units rushed to the scene. When deputies arrived, they found Catherine lying on the floor, gravely injured. Despite their efforts, she didn't survive. Colin was taken into custody at the scene, visibly shaken but giving a calm statement. He told investigators the stabbing had been accidental. But as detectives began examining the evidence, the story no longer added up. The wound Catherine sustained was deep, the kind of injury that couldn't easily happen from falling on a knife. The medical examiner's report confirmed it. Forensic evidence inside the home also showed signs of a violent struggle. To the Polk County Sheriff's Office, this was no accident. They believed Colin had attacked his mother during the argument, and they charged him with first-degree murder and kidnapping. News of the arrest spread fast across Florida. What made the story even more shocking was that this was the second time Colin had been involved in a parent's death in less than 2 years. Many wondered, was this coincidence or a pattern? And more importantly, what had really happened inside that house? As the community mourned Catherine, questions grew louder. Was Colin a dangerous young man hiding behind stories of self-defense? Or had years of family trauma pushed him into another tragic situation no one could fully understand? In the coming months, those answers would be put to the ultimate test inside a courtroom. When detectives began piecing together the details of Catherine Griffith's final hours, they quickly realized this was not an ordinary family dispute gone wrong. The more they learned about 17-year-old Colin's past, the more disturbing the story became. In the days after Catherine's death, investigators sat down with her relatives, including her mother, Susan Detman, and her eldest son, Christopher. What they revealed painted a picture of years filled with heartbreak, fear, and unanswered questions. According to Susan, Colin had always been a bright but troubled child. He struggled with his emotions, and his relationship with his parents had been tense for years. When Catherine and her ex-husband separated, Colin spent time living with his father in Oklahoma, a period that would later end in tragedy. Detectives were stunned when Susan told them something chilling. "His father's dead," she said quietly, "and Colin was the one who shot him." 2 years before Catherine's murder, Colin had shot his father, reportedly during a violent confrontation. He was just 15 years old at the time. The case, handled by Oklahoma authorities, was ruled self-defense. Investigators there determined they couldn't disprove Colin's story that his father had threatened him with a knife, leaving the teenager no choice but to protect himself. After that, Colin was sent to live with his mother in Florida. Catherine took him in despite everything. She wanted to believe that with patience, love, and professional help, she could help him heal. But as detectives learned, the relationship between them was far from peaceful. Family members told police that Catherine was strict but caring. She tried to set boundaries, but Colin resented her authority. Arguments became common, sometimes over schoolwork, sometimes over his behavior, and occasionally over his sexuality, something that reportedly caused tension with his father. Before his death, Christopher recalled a conversation when their mother mentioned Colin's growing anger. She said she was trying, but he just kept pushing back, he told detectives. She was scared sometimes. That fear turned out to be justified. Police reports showed that just weeks before Catherine's death, officers had responded to the Griffith home for another domestic incident. The situation was resolved without an arrest, but it showed the tension inside their household was spiraling out of control. As detectives dug deeper, they examined text messages, call logs, and social media posts between Catherine and her friends in the days leading up to her death. The messages told a heartbreaking story. On the morning of September 11th, Catherine texted a friend saying she had finally reached her limit. "I threw him out," she wrote. "I can't deal with him anymore." She described how she was cutting off his phone, selling his car, and even disenrolling him from school. It seemed she had decided to take a stand to show Colin that she wouldn't tolerate his behavior any longer. But that decision would tragically lead to her death just hours later. Investigators believe that after Catherine confronted Colin, an argument broke out. It escalated quickly, from shouting to physical struggle, until Colin grabbed a knife. Evidence showed the fight likely moved from one room to another, ending in the kitchen where Catherine was stabbed. The young man's 911 call initially sounded frantic, even remorseful, but when detectives interviewed him at the station, his story changed several times. First, he claimed it was an accident. Then, he suggested his mother had attacked him first. But the physical evidence, the knife's angle, the force of the wound, and the signs of restraint told another story. Catherine had not fallen onto the knife. She had been stabbed during a confrontation that spiraled out of control. The case soon captured national attention. News outlets across the country ran headlines like, "Florida teen accused of killing his mother 2 years after killing his father." The story shocked the public and divided opinion. Some people believed Colin was a victim of long-term trauma, a boy who never received the mental health care he needed. Others saw something darker, a pattern of violence that began with his father's death and ended with his mother's. Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd called the case one of the most tragic his department had ever handled. "This young man's life was filled with anger and pain," he said during a press briefing. "But nothing justifies taking your mother's life. Nothing." Meanwhile, Catherine's family struggled to process their grief. Her mother, Susan, described her daughter as a loving parent who did everything she could to help her son. "She wanted him to get better," Susan said through tears. "She gave him everything she had, and he still took her away from us. The prosecution believed they had a strong case. They charged Colin with first-degree murder and kidnapping, citing the neighbor's witness account of him dragging Catherine into the house as she screamed for help. They also pointed to the evidence that he prevented her from leaving before the stabbing occurred. Colin's defense attorneys, however, prepared to argue that the act wasn't premeditated, that it was the tragic result of years of emotional turmoil and untreated psychological trauma. They emphasized his youth and his difficult past, including the earlier shooting of his father. Still, prosecutors made it clear Catherine's death was deliberate. They described it as a moment of rage, not self-defense. The courtroom battle ahead promised to be emotional and complex, with both sides presenting vastly different versions of the truth. For the detectives who worked the case, one question lingered. Could anyone have stopped this from happening? They had records showing Catherine sought help multiple times, reaching out to local authorities, mental health professionals, and even her own family. Yet, despite her efforts, the cycle of fear and violence continued until it ended in tragedy. As Colin sat in a juvenile detention facility awaiting trial, reporters and online commentators debated what his future might hold. Would he be tried as an adult? Could he ever reintegrate into society if found guilty? And what did this case say about the cracks in the system? A system that seemed unable to protect either parent from the same child? Behind every headline was a haunting reality. 2 lives destroyed, one by death, the other by irreversible consequence. The courtroom was silent when the young defendant walked in, dressed in a pale blue jail uniform, his hands cuffed. 17-year-old Collin Griffith avoided the eyes of his family members sitting just feet away. The same family who had once fought to protect him now sat there grieving the loss of his mother and struggling to understand how everything had gone so wrong. The trial of Collin Griffith would become one of the most emotionally charged cases Polk County had seen in years. Reporters filled the gallery, cameras lined the courthouse steps, and the community waited for answers. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They painted a grim picture of a home consumed by tension, a mother desperate to help her troubled son, and a teenager growing more volatile with each passing day. Prosecutor Lisa Hernandez told the jury, this was not a sudden accident. This was an escalation, a pattern of violence that began long before that tragic night. She recounted how Catherine had called family members just hours before her death, saying she'd finally had enough. She was cutting off her son financially, selling his car, and even removing him from school. She wanted to draw the line, Hernandez continued. But instead, her own child crossed it in the most horrific way imaginable. The prosecution's evidence was damning: text messages, photos from the crime scene, and Colin's inconsistent statements to police. They also showed video from the patrol car where Colin, just hours before his release from a prior domestic disturbance, had told officers he might hurt his mother if sent back home. I don't know what I'll do if I go back there, he had said. I'm scared of what could happen. To the prosecution, those words weren't just a warning. They were a confession of intent. The defense, led by public defender Mark Delaney, took a different approach. They didn't deny that Colin had killed his mother, but they argued that the act was the tragic result of years of trauma, untreated mental illness, and emotional instability. Delaney described a boy who never received the help he needed after witnessing violence at home, losing his father in a traumatic confrontation, and being shuffled through systems that failed to protect either parent. Colin wasn't a monster, Delaney told the jury. He was a child in pain, a child who asked for help, and no one truly listened. He pointed to records showing that Colin had been Baker acted involuntarily, committed for evaluation just months before the killing. Mental health professionals had flagged him as high risk but released him after a short observation period. Instead of getting long-term treatment, Delaney said, he went right back into the same environment that caused his breakdown. To some in the courtroom, this explanation rang true. But for others, including Catherine's family, it felt like an attempt to excuse the inexcusable. As the trial continued, both sides brought in witnesses who knew the Griffiths personally. Friends, neighbors, and even school counselors took the stand. Some described Catherine as a loving mother who sacrificed everything for her son. Others noted her strictness, the rules, the curfews, the consequences she enforced when Colin broke them. Detectives testified about the crime scene, describing the struggle that took place in the kitchen and the chaos left behind. The jury listened closely as prosecutors played audio clips of Colin's police interviews. His voice calm one moment, trembling the next. When it came time for the medical examiner's testimony, the room grew heavy. The evidence showed Catherine had tried to fight back. There were defensive wounds on her hands and bruises along her arms. Proof. The prosecution argued that she had fought for her life until the very end. After nearly 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. The prosecution urged the jury to deliver justice for Catherine. She brought him into this world, Hernandez said passionately, and he took her out of it. This was not a child defending himself. This was rage. This was control. This was murder. The defense, meanwhile, made one final plea for understanding. He's a teenager, Delaney said. A broken young man who never learned how to cope with fear and anger. You can punish him, but remember, this system failed both of them long before that night. When the jury finally left to deliberate, the courtroom sat in silence. Hours passed. Then, late that evening, they returned with their verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Collin Griffith was spared the most severe sentence possible, but the judge made it clear this was a tragedy with no winners. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with the possibility of review after 25. As the verdict was read, Colin wept quietly. Behind him, his grandmother clutched a framed photo of Catherine, smiling, happy, unaware of what her future would hold. In the months following the trial, the story of Catherine and Collin Griffith continued to echo far beyond Florida. Mental health advocates used the case as an example of how early intervention can make a difference. Lawmakers debated whether the state's mental health system needed reform, particularly when dealing with juveniles in crisis. Sheriff Grady Judd later told reporters, "This case broke our hearts. You can't help but wonder, if someone had stepped in sooner, maybe this wouldn't have happened." Catherine's family established a small foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting parents of at-risk youth and promoting access to counseling services. "We can't change what happened," her sister said during a vigil, "but we can try to stop it from happening again." As for Colin, he remains incarcerated, a young man who will spend most of his adult life behind bars, haunted by what he did. His letters to relatives reportedly express regret and confusion. "I wish I could take it back," one letter read. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." But for Catherine's loved ones, those words will never bring her back. What remains is the devastating truth that sometimes even love, patience, and second chances aren't enough to save a family from breaking apart. If you found this story important or heartbreaking, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next true crime story. Every share and comment helps keep Catherine's story and stories like hers from being forgotten. Because sometimes, understanding tragedy is the first step toward preventing the next one.